past that impacts the present and future. In particular, his research engages the creation and curation of public memory sites, as well as grassroots civil society activism, both as a means for shaping public memory and transforming post-conflict societies. And as part of this work, Dr. Whigham has conducted field research across Latin America, Europe, the United States, and now Africa. So it is my privilege to present to you Dr. Kerry.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's really such a pleasure to be here at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, a site that I've been reading about and researching from afar and participating in the events for a very long time. And it's so lovely to finally be here in person and to see exactly how vibrant this space is. It really is a memory site that is quite alive and doing some really incredible work. Thanks especially to Tally Mates for inviting me and the whole staff here. It's just been so wonderful. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day to everyone. When you do work on memory and memory activism, you inherently are doing work with women because women are, in almost every case, at the forefront of making sure the memory of the past survives in the present. It's especially prescient that I'm speaking on this day. So I think I have a little presentation that will be pulled up. So I was asked to speak about this book of mine that just got published, which has been a very long process, called Resonant Violence. And both this presentation and the book start with a story that I want to begin with today. I'm moving away from South Africa, really, back to where I'm from, the United States. And let's see. Oh, is it not on? Excuse me, everyone.
Technology.
There we go. And this is a story that took place in November of 2016 in North Dakota, in the United States, on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, which is a reservation for one Native population in the United States. And on this reservation, there was a big occupation movement, an activist movement of occupation called Occupy Standing Rock. And these activists, who refer to themselves as water protectors, were occupying this land to protest the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the oil pipeline that was being constructed through this unceded Sioux territory and also through sacred indigenous ground. And they were protesting the construction of this pipeline to protect the water because there was very high evidence that the construction of this pipeline would disrupt access to water for many people around the pipeline. And as I was watching, and during this occupation, specifically on the night of November 10th, 2016, the Morton County Sheriff's Department turned against these peaceful protesters, firing rubber bullets, shooting water hoses in freezing temperatures, locking some of them in cages and dog cages, as just to show you how dehumanizing this entire process was. And as I was reading and watching about this, I heard one 26-year-old activist named Erin Wise say something that just really struck me, considering the work I've been doing on this book. She said, "No one realizes the repercussions of colonization, what they have been, the repercussions of forced removal." And then she finished that quote by saying, "The abuse lives in our blood." There it is. Now, as the field of genocide studies has grown, it's become common to understand the trauma of genocide as something that is passed down for generations, from victims and survivors to their children. There's this idea that abuse lives on through the blood, through the body, and through memories. It's less common, however, to consider how that abuse lives on also through all members of a society in different ways. That abuse doesn't only live on in the blood of those that are most directly victimized, but it certainly does in the most negative and impactful ways. It lives in the body and blood of all members of a society: victims, bystanders, collaborators, and even perpetrators. Now, of course, it doesn't live on in the same way for all of those people. In fact, the legacies of past abuse are sustained exactly because they live on in negative ways for many, but they also continue to benefit others, most specifically people who would typically fall into this category of perpetrators and bystanders. And Standing Rock is really a perfect example of this, because the abuse continues for Native people in the United States today, and really around the world. But non-Native people like myself also continue to benefit from the stolen land and from a system of impunity that allows the police to exercise force like this on peaceful protesters at Standing Rock. So this book, Resonant Violence, is really my attempt to reconceptualize our understanding of genocidal violence and atrocity violence as something that lives on for entire societies, continuing to impact them long after the physical violence of killing comes to an end. And more than that, I hope it's an exploration of the creative practices that many have developed, first to acknowledge that violence, and then to transform it into new forms of agency and power. So what I want to do in this presentation is first articulate some of the reasons for writing this book, aside from what I've already stated, introduce you to this concept of resonant violence that serves as the title of the book, and then outline some of the memory initiatives that I examine in this book as a response to resonant violence. Now, when I wrote this book, I was really responding to what I see as three gaps in the ways that we conceive of concepts relating to genocide and large-scale identity-based violence. And I'm using the term genocide beyond the legal terminology. I'm really talking about large-scale identity-based violence in all its forms. I want to be especially clear about that when I'm speaking in the context of South Africa today. The first gap is what I see as something missing in our understanding of the nature of genocidal violence. There's typically, when we talk about genocide and other mass atrocities, there's a real focus on physical violence. We've gotten to a point where we understand genocides and other mass atrocities as processes, not as something that just happened overnight. That there are stages that if we don't intervene, they can escalate to the point of what we typically label as genocide or a mass atrocity. But even with this understanding of genocide and atrocities as a process, much of that focuses on the precursors, those early stages of atrocity. And we don't really focus as much on the legacies and what is left behind when that physical violence comes to an end. And even when we do, those legacies are often understood as unfortunate consequences of the violence, rather than as part and parcel of the atrocity itself. It is actually the genocide living on. So focusing on the physical violence of genocide really ignores the complex ways that societies suffer, economically, socially, institutionally, beyond just physically. Second is something missing in the way that we approach prevention. And I talk about this because in addition to my work as an academic, I also work for this international non-governmental organization called the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, where we're really focusing on working with governments around the world to develop policies to protect vulnerable populations, whatever they may be in given society. And part of the work that we're really trying to emphasize is to move beyond thinking about prevention as intervention in the midst of crisis. And I'm speaking about this, is especially important to acknowledge right now when we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. real prevention is much more about acknowledging the early stages, the precursors that we know can lead to atrocity, and taking action so that they never escalate to the point of large-scale physical violence. It's also about moving beyond an idea that the state or the government is the only the prevention actor, that actually prevention is something that all of us can take part in different ways. A traditional understanding of genocide as just physical violence really reinforces a narrow view of prevention as intervention in the midst of crisis. So when we see the ways that genocidal violence continues, though, in more obscure forms that create or perpetuate risk, that also opens up new avenues for prevention, and it enables new kinds of prevention actors. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean. And then I keep jumping ahead. Also, the third thing is the framework of trauma. Trauma plays a very important role when we're talking about responses to genocide and other mass atrocities, because it's a way for us to understand what those groups who have been most directly victimized and targeted by atrocity violence, their experiences of that violence and how it continues to live on. So trauma is an incredibly important thing to understand. But genocides are also perpetrated by entire societies, and entire societies are impacted by the effects of genocide, sometimes for the bad, but also sometimes for the good. And so that's why I think we need to move beyond only looking at trauma to think about all of the ways that societies are impacted. So to resolve these different gaps that I see, I've really developed this concept of resonant violence. Resonant violence is the term I use to describe the affective energy of large-scale violence. And by affective, I mean this emotional and social energy, this emotional environment is created. And that violence both, should I wait or no?
It's just the popping.
Sorry. So that violence both precedes the mass killing of groups, and it also continues to resonate within individuals and communities even after that killing stops. So although genocide is traditionally understood, especially by the lay person, as the attempted physical annihilation of a targeted identity group, this conception of genocide really only highlights the most visible aspects of genocide. But in fact, the murder of a group is only part of the violence of genocide. This physical component is both preceded and followed by this affective or emotional violence that pervades an entire society and that has any number of effects, including, but not limited to, the physical act of murder. So really, the attempt to destroy an entire group physically through mass murder cannot occur until and unless this affective violence is firmly established within a society. Typically, the facts and figures that are most often recalled about past genocides and past atrocities are those statistics that illustrate the number of victims. And those statistics are often effective and haunting, and they're important, but they also often obscure those other forms of violence that are the product of the process of genocide, and that in fact may still be present even after the killing itself is stopped. Genocide involves the construction of this emotional environment that allows for other forms of violence, as I said, like social inequality, institutional discrimination, and economic disparity among groups, just to name a few examples. And both, going back to the Standing Rock example, both the appropriation of native land and the police response to activist dissent are concrete examples of resonant violence in action. Turning to a case that's more that's related very much to the site where I am now. When World War II ended and the Nazis were defeated by the Allied forces, the systematic physical killing of Jewish victims in Nazi death camps and on the Eastern Front ended. But the affective violence and anti-Semitism that allowed for that killing to occur in the first place did not disappear. Survivors were not only forced to deal with the enduring trauma of their harms that they and their loved ones had experience, they also confronted economic and social violence as they worked to rebuild their lives, along with the continued threat of physical violence for some, as pogroms and other forms of identity-based violence continued in places like Poland, for instance, even decades after World War II ended. And really, this affective violence is still quite present today, and that's evident in the recent growth of far-right nationalist groups in Europe and around the world to invoke anti-Semitic tropes to champion their political agendas. And of course, we can use the exact same logic to talk about the legacies of apartheid in South Africa, which are still very, very much present, as you all know very well. But what I'm trying to focus on in this book is not only trying to identify that violence, but look at responses to the way that resident violence is functioning. And my main focus is on what I call co-embodied practices, which are these ritual acts that are performed by individual people coming together in public space and acting in concert, acting towards shared goals. And I'm specifically interested in those that are acting towards shared goals of transforming that violence into new forms of positive power and agency to build more democratic societies that respect the human rights of all people. So really the book is about first outlining the theory of resonant violence, but then turning to look at a series of these kinds of practices, memory practices, that serve to transform it. And I'll give you some examples of how some of those practices. First, I look at practices of memorialization. And the first two chapters really are very tied to why I'm here in South Africa right now. I'm here as part of this project with my colleague Kayla Murphy. And we're visiting sites of memory relating to genocide, relating to apartheid, relating to colonization here in South Africa, and also visiting sites of memory in other countries around the world to see how these sites are responding to human rights in the present and the promotion and protection of human rights in the present. I believe very strongly that sites of memory can have a very positive contribution to transforming violence in post-atrocity societies, though they don't necessarily always do that. The first two chapters of the book are looking at some sites that are trying to do that and trying to identify how they're doing it. So the first chapter looks at practices of memorialization. And this is looking specifically using, it takes the form of a walking tour through the city of Berlin and looking specifically at memorialization relating to the Holocaust. Though it's using that as a case study for looking at how practices of memorialization have changed all over the world in the aftermath of the Holocaust, really. So on this walking tour through the city of Berlin, that's the form of the chapter, we visit 6 different memorials. Each is referring to that same period of time of violence that occurred during World War II and the Holocaust. And each was constructed at a different time after that period of violence. So when we look at these different memorials, it actually illustrates the shift that has happened, not just in Germany, but all over the world, that is deeply tied to this paradigmatic shift that happened when the Holocaust occurred. So these are the 6 memorials that we look at, and just I'll really quickly walk you through that. The first is actually not related to the Holocaust at all. It's a war memorial, the Soviet War Memorial, which memorializes Soviet soldiers who died in the Battle of Berlin. But we start here because until the Holocaust, really most memorials around the world looked like this. We're using this vernacular language, this architectural language, to commemorate death. And it was really about commemorating soldiers who died in battle for a righteous cause. And of course, when the Holocaust happened, no more could we always think about death as being for a righteous cause, right? No more were people being martyred for this higher cause. They were being slaughtered and dehumanized. So this language, this architectural language had to start to change to respond to this new reality where states were not the protectors of people, but they were the murderers of people, of their own citizens. Then we move to this memorial, which is a very strange small memorial called the Herbert Memorial Stone. This was a memorial created during the Soviet period in the former East Berlin, to commemorate a group of Jewish activists who attacked a Nazi propaganda and were imprisoned, along with 500 other Jewish people who were rounded up after this bombing. And what's interesting about this is the Soviets created this memorial, and in doing so, they erased the Jewishness of Herbert and the resistance fighters, calling them communists who were fighting for the advent of the Soviet Union, which is in some ways true, but then, but did not identify them as Jewish in any way, which is of course why they were killed in its aftermath. But now there's new plexiglass plates on this that explain and contextualize this memorial, but those new plates that were installed years and decades later after the Soviet period actually now erase the fact that they were communists. They do acknowledge that they were Jewish, but don't acknowledge they were communists. So this sort of shows the complexity of memory and how it changes over time. The next memorial is the memorial to the victims of war and tyranny, which was the first attempt by the reunified German government to memorialize the victims of the Holocaust. But the problem is they were memorializing them alongside the soldiers who fought in World War II, the German soldiers, who were actually, of course, perpetrating crimes against Jewish people on the Eastern Front. So this was a largely unsuccessful and controversial memorial, but an important step in the process of memorialization in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Across the street from that is this memorial to the Nazi book burning of Jews. And here we see a much more symbolic memorial that shows underground an empty library to represent the knowledge and the people who were destroyed over the period of the Holocaust as the writings that were contradictory to the Nazis were destroyed. I'll skip this one. And then the chapter ends by going to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is opened in 2005 and has now become really a model that has shaped the memorialization of Holocaust, not only the Holocaust, but all kinds of atrocities all over the world. This is one of the first memorials that really moved away from this idea of creating a space that was about teaching about the past, and it's really about creating a feeling or an emotional connection with the past. It's meant to be an immersive monument that connects affectively and emotionally with the visitor. And I talk about the ramifications of that. But after this chapter that looks at these monuments and memorials, then we turn to sites of atrocity that have been turned into sites of memory. And that chapter really spends most of its time focusing on two sites. The first, the iconic Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland, relating to, of course, the Holocaust, and also another concentration camp, but on the other side of the world in Argentina, called ESMA, which was the largest concentration and detention center during the military dictatorship that took hold in Argentina from the late 1970s to the early 1980s. And this chapter examines both the choices that curators of these sites make, how they fill these empty spaces, and how those choices they make really have an important impact on the processing of resident violence. But they also look at how visitors fill those spaces themselves through their actions, how they engage with those spaces. So this is an example of an action that took place in ESMA. This detention center in Argentina was in operation when Argentina was hosting the World Cup, the soccer World Cup in 1978. Argentina won that year. And the stadium where the World Cup final happened was just around the corner from this torture and detention center. So the people being detained and tortured in this center could literally hear the cheers of their countrymen and women as the Argentinian national team was winning its victory in the World Cup. In response to that, 30 years later, on the anniversary of that victory, the family members of those who died in this site met at that site, unfurled this banner with the pictures of their lost loved ones, and marched from that site into the stadium, carrying their loved ones out of that site of pain and trying to reclaim that stadium site and marking it again as a site of joy. And a group of survivors, family members, formerly exiled people, and human rights defenders played an exhibition football match that was broadcast all over the country as a form of celebrating those who lost their lives during the dictatorship. So a really interesting use of this space of death, turning it into the space of life. But sometimes the chapter also looks at the controversies that can emerge when when it comes to the politics of dealing with these really difficult sites of atrocity. This part of that is looking at a controversy that emerged when this disco system, this bar and dance club, opened in the town of Oświęcim, which is where Auschwitz-Birkenau is in Poland. This was a dance club that was not in the historically protected area of the camps, but nonetheless, when it opened, it really drew the attention of the international community, who saw this as an offense to the memory of the victims of Auschwitz. And in looking at that controversy and another controversy that happened in Argentina, I'm less interested in taking a stance on whether or not it was a good decision, and more interested in looking at how those moments of debate and discussion and controversy are actually essential in making the memory of the past present. And they become essential parts of a conversation where we all are determining how we are supposed to relate to the past. In many ways, those controversial moments are the ones that ensure more than any others that the past remain present. The next chapter looks at what I call practices of transaction, and specifically an activist practice in Argentina that emerged in the 1990s. After the military dictatorship, there were thousands of military officers who perpetrated human rights abuses, who were remaining free and unpunished for the human rights abuses and crimes that they committed during the dictatorship. I know you know nothing about that in South Africa either. But in the light of that, a group of the children of those who were disappeared created this practice called the escrache, which comes from the Spanish slang verb escrachar, which means to uncover or to bring something to light. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. They would march through the streets to the homes of people who were known to have perpetrated human rights abuses, known to have killed people during the dictatorship. And they would mark their homes with paint. You see them painting the street in front of their houses here with a sign saying, "Here lives a free genocidaire," and that person's name. And this was a way of saying, if the state isn't going to put these people on trial and put them on prison, then we are going to make sure that everyone around us knows who these people are, knows what they did, so that their own home becomes a prison, so that the baker will stop selling them bread, so that the taxi driver will stop driving them, so that the newspaper vendor will stop selling newspapers. And they continued this until the state, they committed to doing this until the government started reopening trials against the perpetrators, which eventually happened. And now over 1,200 of these perpetrators have been brought to justice through the legal court system. And then finally, I end by looking at practices of occupation, like Standing Rock, like I look at the Rosenstrasse across a protest in Germany, where groups of people, of activists, congregate in one space, one symbolic space, but by occupying that space, send a message out to an entire nation, to an entire world, trying to reclaim that space and what it means. And the focus of this chapter is actually on one occupation that took place in my country, in the United States, on the island, on Alcatraz Island, which was a federal prison. And when that prison was decommissioned, a group of Native American activists claimed that land as indigenous land, as a way of visibilizing indigenous populations and trying to make a claim for their rights in the present. And while they didn't succeed at maintaining that island, their act of occupation completely changed the way that the U.S. government related to indigenous populations then, and that change continues into the present. So the cases I describe in this book really demonstrate the powerful and unexpected things that can occur when groups of people recognize resident violence and come together to transform it. Through practices of memorialization, curation, visitation, transaction, and occupation, individuals in numerous post-atrocity contexts, and I focus on these three, but obviously every context in the world you could draw examples from, These groups have come together in response to the damaging affect of resonant violence, and by working in concert, they have transformed at least a portion of that negative affect and transformed the way the past functions in the present. Before concluding, however, I do want to sound a note of caution, if only to stress that overcoming such a devastating force is not at all a foregone conclusion. The picture is not always so rosy, and even in the cases where these co-embodied practices succeed, it doesn't mean the work is over. Because rooting out systemic identity-based violence in all its forms is a perpetual project to which all people must be committed. And I'll give you an example of that. While I was doing research for this book, I went with two other people, and I traveled what's called the Trail of Tears, which was a group, which was a path of forced expulsion of Indigenous people in the United States from the Southeast westward to, they had to walk over 2,000 kilometers on foot in the winter. Many people died along the way so that white settlers could take their land. And I traveled this Trail of Tears National Historic Trail to visit the memory sites along the way that commemorate that journey, that commemorate that path of death as they were forcibly expelled from their land. And along that way, I visited many of the 80+ sites that commemorated that journey. And while I had many troubling moments that I confronted, where I confronted my own privilege as a non-Indigenous American, the most powerful was one that struck me really unexpectedly. I was in a place called the Trail of Tears State Park, which is a state park, a beautiful state park in Missouri, outside of Jackson, Missouri, that sits alongside the Mississippi River at a point where the Cherokee Indians had to cross the river to continue their journey westward. And in this park, they had a visitor center that I went to, and there was a gift shop there that sold a number of items to maintain the park, the benefits of which maintain the park. And in that park, in that gift shop, so this is the park, and in that gift shop, they sell these little lapel pins with the logo of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. So I wanted to buy some of these to commemorate this journey. And the very kind shopwoman told me how much they were, and I reached into my wallet and I pulled out a $20 bill. And I looked at that bill, and on the $20 bill in the US is the portrait of Andrew Jackson, who is the president, who was the orchestrator of the forced removal of the Cherokee, these people who were being commemorated in the site. And I paid, and I got the pins, and we stepped outside, and I looked at the car we were driving, which was my parents' car. And in the US, on the license plates, it says the county where you're from, where the car is registered. And my parents live in Jackson County, named after Andrew Jackson. And then we went to a hotel in Jackson, Missouri, which was named after Andrew Jackson after he won several battles in the War of 1812. During those were battles that he fought where he defeated and killed a number of Muskogee Indians through a whole array of atrocities that occurred. And several days earlier, I had visited another site on the trail called the Hermitage, which was Andrew Jackson's plantation. And this was a site that had more people than any of the sites that I had visited that were commemorating Indigenous people. And it was a site that was really about celebrating Andrew Jackson as a populist hero in American history. And there was very little mention of the Indigenous people who had to walk through his property on the way westward. And there was very little mention of the over 100 people who were enslaved on what was for them a concentration camp. So everywhere I turned that afternoon and throughout the trip, it felt as though Andrew Jackson was there. This genocidaire, this war criminal, was inescapable, but those who suffered because of him were far less present. So I began this presentation with that moment of inspirational activism of the water protectors at Standing Rock, who spent late 2016 protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Despite the global attention that their activism garnered, however, their practice did not succeed at the goal. The pipeline was constructed, it was completed in April 2017, it became commercially operational 2 months later, and it's still in operation today. So both the story of Standing Rock and my experience along the Trail of Tears really illustrate the insidious power of resonant violence. Despite the inspiring picture I may have painted with some of the practices I talked about that transform the way violence functions, these practices don't always succeed, and in fact, all too often they fail. But there's hope that I try to grip onto. In 2019 and 2020, protesters in Hong Kong spent months occupying the city streets, demanding freedom and the revocation of the encroaching power of mainland China. In 2018, millions in Argentina took to the streets, and the Ni Una Menos movement, sparking a national reckoning with violence and discrimination against women. Despite the restrictions of the global pandemic, hundreds of thousands of US Americans took to the streets in 2020 in response to the police killing of George Floyd, leading to widespread calls for policing reform and a more comprehensive approach to dealing with our legacies of enslavement in the United States. These collective responses to resonant violence, born out of so much hardship and pain, are perhaps the best hope we have. By coming together in the face of resonant violence that seeks to push them apart, these collectives are performing and indeed enacting a better, more peaceful world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kerry, for that fascinating presentation. And as you were speaking, there's a phrase that always comes to mind when I deal with very difficult issues, either in my life or in society in general. And that is the ability to turn poison into medicine. And I was thinking that phrase was running through my mind as you were speaking. But my first question, I'm sure there will be many questions that will come, even from the audience that is here physically. Please, I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions. And for those joining us live, please post your questions on the chat function. But my first question is, you mentioned the phrase abuse lives in our blood. And it's actually in the first chapter of the book. That's the name of the chapter, the first chapter of the book. I wanted to ask about resistance. People who resist this inheritance in our blood. Is it possible, maybe in your research, have you found societies where the society has been able to heal even in spite of this resistance? Because there's always a group of people who say, well, I didn't benefit from such and such. There's some kind of amnesia that takes place in some situations. Is it possible to heal the society even in spite of this resistance?
Yeah, it's always really difficult because in every case, there are those who have no interest. It's against their self-interest, right, to actually deal with the legacies of abuse that are still present, because actually they continue to benefit, right? So in order to really process resonant violence fully, what you need sometimes is for people to act against their own self-interest. And that's a really difficult thing to do, to get people to empathize with others to the extent that they say, my rights can't be protected, and my life can't be upheld if it's done on the backs of other people whose rights are being violated on a consistent basis. There will always be those who refuse to acknowledge that, but I think for a real reckoning to take place, it has to begin with acknowledgement. It has to begin with the way that abuse is still present. And you know, the real trick of it too is what a very long half-life this resonant violence can have. It doesn't go away quickly, and it doesn't go away without intention. So, I mean, it's just seeing all of these memory sites while I'm visiting here in South Africa, it's very clear that while some incredible advancements have been made since before 1994, there are also some things that haven't changed as rapidly as most people would want them to change, right? But not all people, of course. That's why they haven't changed. And that's only 28 years after. We're also, I mean, there's an impulse in my country where a lot of the abuses that, I mean, I come from a country that was founded on the dual atrocities of the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of Black populations. Those things happened many years ago. I would argue they're not over, but there's a very big tendency for people to say, but it's so far in the past, we have to just move on. But whenever we hear those words that we need to move on, we always have to ask, who is asking? Who's asking to move on? Because it's never the ones who have been most directly impacted negatively by that violence. It's always the people who are benefiting from that violence continuing. So until the people who have been the most directly negatively impacted to that violence start saying it's time to move on, I don't think we can start really having that conversation.
Do you have any questions already? I have another question now. My next question is, you've looked at Europe and you've looked at South America. In your studies, did you look at Asia? Are there any sites that you're able to visit or to do some research in that part of the world?
The book is focusing on these three cases, and I'm a comparativist, so I always, I chose these three cases, but it could have been a million other cases, right? It's always difficult to narrow down what you're going to focus on. I haven't spent an immense amount of time in Asia, but as part of the research project I'm working on now, as part of the reason I'm here, one of the countries that we'll be visiting is Cambodia, and looking at the ways that Cambodia is dealing with its legacies of violence related to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. I've also done some work on Indonesia and the mass killings that occurred there in the 1960s that are still largely unrecognized. There's still a pact of silence that exists around those killings that are really foundational for the modern state of Indonesia. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on any of these cases, but I'm going through the process now of trying to learn from them and what they have to teach us as well.
There's a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's really a wonderful work that I'm looking forward to read. The Andrew Jackson example is a really glaring one. When you say that it's not only the state, but it is other actors that can change the narrative, can you tell us a little bit of processes that can challenge, for example, the Andrew Jackson story? And then regarding Germany, we in South Africa, 2015, roads must fall, the statues that are going down. Germany did it certainly in their way, certainly after its reunification. Can you tell us some examples, perhaps, where the past is acknowledged, but acknowledged fully, and it's a way to, again, help us to move forward in a better way? So, two sides of the question.
What I found is that very often in the aftermath of genocides, of the large-scale abuse of human rights, the government or the state is the one who is typically the most reticent to enact large-scale change, because the government will do what it needs to do to consolidate its own power, to allow it to continue to exist. And governments will only take bigger steps when there is enough pressure from below. And I think that's really what the book focuses on, is how widespread social change in almost all of the cases where I've looked at never comes from the top down, it always comes from the bottom up. And South Africa, of course, is a beautiful example of that. I mean, 1994 would have never happened were it not from the grassroots, right? To me, it's all about actions that we're taking at the grassroots and trying to slowly build upward enough pressure to push the state, which is inherently a conservative. The state is always more conservative, a conservative institution. So we're always trying to push it to do more. And that can happen really in small ways and big ways. Small ways are big ways. We can see these activist movements that are happening, like the occupation of Standing Rock in relation to Indigenous genocide. There can also be small actions that we take as individuals. There's now a much bigger movement in the United States too. And one of the biggest problems we have with Indigenous populations is they're invisible to most people. It's less than 1% of the US population. And most people go through their entire lives without ever meeting someone who's Indigenous. So they are not a point of concern for most people. So one of the actions that we really try to do is to re-visibilize these populations, making sure that when we're hosting events, for instance, at the university, that we are inviting Indigenous speakers, that we're giving them a voice, that we're not talking only about them, but we're talking with them, that we're hearing from them, that we're learning from them. And it can also be smaller things, like for instance, making sure that when I speak in the US, always acknowledging whose land I'm speaking from. Or for instance, one time I got a $20 bill as change, and next to Andrew Jackson, someone had written underneath it, genocidaire, you know? So these are also actions, things that just make you think differently, that knock you out of your comfort zone, small and large. A country that I talk about a lot in the book that I think the world has a lot to learn from, I've learned an immense amount from, is Argentina. Because this is a country that, in the aftermath of the military dictatorship, where large-scale human rights abuses have happened, over 30,000 citizens have been disappeared, and that's not to mention all of the other forms of violence that took place in that country. There was a long period of impunity, as I mentioned, where no one was being prosecuted. The narrative was, let's move on, we need to move forward so that we can build up, we can be respected by the world, we can't keep turning backwards. And because of the activism of groups like the mothers of those who were disappeared, the grandmothers of those who disappeared, the children of those who disappeared, fighting consistently and saying, we cannot move on without first looking backwards, without first dealing with the past. Now, Argentina has instituted some of the most radical justice measures, including reparations programs, including large-scale reform of the judiciary, of the education sector, of all areas of the state, of the military, including truth commissions and processes. All of these things happened, and again, always because of grassroots civil society pressure.
We have other questions from the chat, from Zoom, which is Nicholas Sadie, I think, says, thank you for your wonderful, inspiring work. My questions concern events that remain unofficially memorialized. Have you come across any examples where resonant violence has been powerfully redirected despite a lack of official memorization, or for healing to happen, does it always require official or state addressals?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, no, I don't think healing always requires the state. Though I think for large-scale transformation reform, ultimately what we want is the state to acknowledge it as well. That is an important step in the process. But we can't always wait on the state because it's a slow actor, right? So, and I also want to be clear that I don't think when an official memorial has been built to something, that's necessarily the best way of processing that violence. I think all too often, there's this really famous quote by this Austrian philosopher named Robert Musil who said, there's nothing as invisible as a monument, right? In many ways, building a memorial, a physical monument to past violence, is a way of turning it into stone and putting it in a box and saying, well, we're putting it there, and then we forget about it, right? How many monuments or memorials do you walk through in your life, and you sort of, your daily life as you're going along about your business, and not read the plaque that's there, not read what it's a memorial to. It happens all the time to all of us. So simply having a memorial to something is not necessarily the answer, which is, I think, why I start the book with the focus on these physical memory spaces and slowly move towards embodied memory practices, how the most powerful memory is when memory lives in us. And that's why I think actually these cited memory, and for instance, a lot of the programming that's happening here at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and other really important sites, the reason they're powerful is not because they exist. It's because of what they do and what people do within them, and then take outward to the community. Because I think Talia and everyone who works here would agree that it would be a failure if all people did was come and visit and then leave and never talk about it, never think about it, their behavior never changes because of what they learn here, right? The goal is for these sites to have an impact, a broader impact in our actions and our behavior outside of these spaces. So that's why I think focusing less on the physicality of the spaces and more on how our actions can be impacted and how we can come together and transform public space through our actions. That's where the real power is, I think.
Do you have another question? I have another question as well. Is there another? I'm happy to give someone the floor if there's a question from the floor. Yes, please give. There's.
Like, so when at the coffee shop, when I ask a question about the Chikokura wound, that even now is not like known, or you as a genocide scholar, I think you said that we can hear about it. I don't know if when it will be acknowledged and scholars or academic know about it and talk about it and memorize it. Because I know for now we're in the process of saying yes, it was genocide, not it was genocide, but almost 22,000 people died or more or less, I don't know, but it's not, we don't know the real number because it was a state sponsored. Thank you.
Thank you.
But anyway, also, because you said earlier that some of them they are not known, but you are in the process of trying to go one by one unto them, you know, and also to acknowledge from those perpetrators that we did this to those. I thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really sad reality that there are so many that are often referred to as hidden genocides all over the world. Atrocities that have happened in countries that have not received attention, that have not received the attention of the world, that have not received the attention of academics, of politicians. Oftentimes it's because of, you know, this is terrible to say. It's a sad reality. And it's the same reason why the world turned their back on Rwanda, for instance, in 1994 when the genocide happened, because most of the world didn't know where Rwanda was. Most of the world didn't care about Rwanda because what happened in Rwanda had no impact on them. And that is all too often the case, that people don't care about things that don't affect them directly. I think that we, as an academic, I think we have an obligation to find these cases and to do our part in visibilizing them. I also don't think academics are always the best at visibilizing things to the rest of the world, because, you know, most people aren't going to read this book, and that's fine. You know, it's like we write for a very restricted audience, you know. But because of that, there are other communities that also can do much better than academics can do. I'm thinking, for instance, of journalists, but I'm also thinking of artists, of filmmakers. I mean, the role of the arts in visibilizing violence, visibilizing the struggle and pain of people who have been persecuted. I'm constantly bowled over by the power, how much more effective art is at telling these stories than I can be as an academic, or any academic can be. But again, everyone has their role to play. So I'm very grateful when people bring these cases that I haven't been attending to, or that we as a world don't attend to my attention, because then I feel like now I have a burden, a responsibility, not a burden, but the negative. I have an obligation and a responsibility to do more research, and to communicate that onward. And we all have to do what we can do. So I thank you for that. It's not enough, but I'm grateful for you bringing that to the floor.
Oh, there's another question.
Please can you tell us more about those successful things where you say they embodied it and they enacted a protest or awareness?
Yeah, I mean, there's really a whole array of them that I get out of the book, and I'm always so interested in activism that's doing something creative and different than simply taking to the streets, so that can be incredibly powerful as well. But I'm really inspired by these groups who come up with creative new ideas for transforming this violence. So, for instance, Tali knows about this because I presented on this before. Another project that I've worked on is called Artivism, which is an art exhibition that started in Venice in the Venice Biennale and is now wrapping up a 1.5-year stint at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And this is an art exhibition that focuses on 6 artist activists who have used art as a way of drawing attention to human rights violations in 6 different countries around the world, and have used art as a form for social and political transformation. One of those comes from Argentina. I'll tell you about another one that is incredibly powerful from Bosnia. A Bosnian American artist named Aida Šehović. She's a refugee from the violence of the civil war in Bosnia in the early 1990s. And she moved to many places because of that war and ended up in the United States, and decided she wanted to use art as a form for raising social awareness and memorializing the victims of the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995, when 8,372 Bosnian Muslims were killed because of who they were, because they were Bosnian Muslims. What she's decided to do was she started having conversations with predominantly the wives and mothers of people who lost loved ones during that genocide. And when she talked to them, the thing that they would say again and again is that the moments that I miss my loved one the most is every morning when I'm having coffee alone. Coffee being a very important part of Bosnian culture. So Aida took this and decided to start collecting these tiny Bosnian coffee cups called filjan, one for each of the 8,372 men and boys who were killed in this genocide. And each year, on the anniversary of the genocide, July 11th, she traveled to a different city around the world, went to a public square, and invited people to come and fill one or more of these cups of coffee and leave them undrunk in that square in honor of the victims of that genocide who were unable to drink that coffee with their family members. So this is what she calls a nomadic monument. It's a memorial, it's a monument, but it only exists for that one day each year in a different city around the world. But what happens when that monument is built on that day is a new community is built at the same time. The diaspora Bosnian refugee population comes together, oftentimes meeting each other for the first time, and that comes together for this moment of recognition, of memory, but also random passersby who know nothing about the genocide come and learn about it. They fill a cup of coffee and leave it, and they participate in creating this new community that it commits itself to memory, commits itself to the protection of human rights in the present. So this is just one example of how these incredibly creative practices, I think, can have a really direct impact on resolving those resonating effects of violence that continue into the future. I could go on and give you many more, but that's just one example from a case I haven't talked about.
Thank you. Do we have another question from Zoom? If not, maybe this will be the last question to conclude. And maybe it's anyone a downer a little bit. But I want to ask, maybe you've touched on this in the book, but I want to ask about bad memories and monuments or sites of memory that represent what some people may term bad memories. We live in a country that has a lot of sites of bad memories. So my question is, does it matter who builds the site of memory and their intention in order for that site to be important or to matter? Does it matter who builds it and what their intention was?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have a tendency to often talk about memory as always a good force, right? There's this idea that quote from George Santayana that he who does not remember the past is condemned to repeat it. And inherent in that quote is this idea that memory on its own is somehow inherently preventive, inherently good. And I think there are way too many examples where we see that that's not the case, that simply remembering the past doesn't prevent violence from occurring. And also, plenty of cases where the past is being used by certain actors, politicians, social leaders, to create great social harm, to continue to oppress groups of people. So memory is not always a good thing, and memorialization is not always a good thing. Right now, in the United States, we're going to, and South Africa has done the same things with the roads must fall, right? We're going through that same thing with all of the monuments to Confederate generals and heroes in the US. We have all of these monuments across the country that honor people who literally fought so that Black people would be enslaved for their entire lives. They would still be enslaved today. And those monuments still exist. So that's not positive. That is not a reflection of good memory. What's been really interesting is seeing how now those sites are being transformed. Some of them are being torn down, and that's great in many cases. What's really interesting is also the ones that are not being torn down are also being engaged with in new ways. So, for instance, they'll be covered in graffiti. This is the same thing that has happened in South Africa, right? Covered in graffiti, painted in different ways. And it makes those monuments that had maybe been invisible to all too many people for too long. And by this, I'm talking about the people who weren't being harmed by that memory. It makes it so that we can't ignore it. We can't ignore that bad memory anymore. We can't say that it's not hurting people. And that's an essential first step in then taking the bigger next step is, okay, not just how do we get rid of those statues, but how do we create new memories that are less harmful, that are actively dealing with and offering redress for the resonating effects of past violence. So it's a process. Memory is never over. It's something we work towards. We're working towards a good memory. But also there's not an end point to that. And it's something we have to remember, because if we think about memory as this thing, we're like, okay, we did all of these things, we built the memorial, we did this truth commission, and now check, memory's done, we're good. As soon as we let it lay there, that's the moment someone can pick it up and use it for incredible harm. So something we always have to be intentionally working towards, making sure that we're building a memory that is honoring all people, that is protecting the human rights of all people. And that for me is the guiding principle of what good memory looks like.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kerry, Whigham. Resonant violence affect memory and activism in post-genocide society. Thank you very much for the presentation. And the book is available here at the Johannesburg Holocaust Center. For those of you who are physically here, the book is available tonight. However, for those people who are not here, I know you have a website, and the book is available also on the website. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about how people can get to your website.
Oh, sure. You can go to it's www.kerrywhigham.com. And there's even a little thing, there's a discount code, so you can get a discount. But tonight, if you get it now, it's 50% off. But there's a discount, I think, on the website too. So yeah.
Thank you. I've just been reminded, yes, here at the Johannesburg Holocaust Center, we have a cafe or a coffee shop called Easy's. And the book also will be available at Easy's, at our coffee shop. here at the center. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you.